They branded me a junkie to steal my life. My mother sold my soul to buy my sister's happiness, and my fiancé laughed as he left me for dead. But today, those cruel smiles are dying. I am Aurelia, and my army is at the gates. This isn't a wedding, it's a reckoning. But before the thunder of the boots, before the truth set me free, there was the night I still believed in the amber glow of their lies. The crystal chandeliers of the Magnolia estate cast a fractured amber light across the ballroom, shimmering like the surface of a shallow sea. I stood at the edge of the gilded hall, my fingers tracing the embossed gold seal on the leather-bound folder in my hand. Inside was my summa cum laude diploma from Johns Hopkins, a piece of parchment that represented 8 years of sleepless nights, the smell of antiseptic, and a soul-deep commitment to the art of healing. To me, a medical degree was never about a title or a seat at the high table of Charleston society. It was a vessel. I believed then, as I do now, that to heal a body is to preserve a soul's chance at finding its own peace. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who claimed to love you, yet felt like a ghost haunting your own life? That was my reality. Harlan approached me, his suit so sharp it could cut, his smile even sharper. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at my diploma, then at the powerful guests watching us. "My love," he said, his voice low and possessive, a tone that had once made me feel safe, but now felt like a cage. "Here it is, the Johns Hopkins University star and real estate heiress. We're going to be the most powerful couple in this city for a century. Think of the doors this opens for your company." A cold, unsettling feeling rose in my stomach. He wasn't talking about my passion for surgery or the lives I hope to save in rural clinics. He was talking about a brand. I turned away from his ambition, my gaze landing on an elderly server struggling with a massive silver tray of champagne. Her hands were trembling under the weight of glass and expectation. I didn't think, I acted. I stepped forward, stabilizing the tray with one hand and offering her a steadying nod. "Take a breath, Mrs. Gable," I whispered, recognizing her from the years she'd worked my mother's parties. "Your wrists need a break. Set it on the side table for a moment. No one is so thirsty that you should have to suffer." She looked at me with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude, a small human connection in a room built on performance. My mother, Delphine, appeared then, cutting through the crowd like a silent blade through silk. Her socialite smile was perfectly calibrated, but her eyes remained as cold as the Atlantic in midwinter. "Aurelia, Harlan, enough mingling," she said, her tone brook no argument. "The public announcement is in 20 minutes. Come to the private study. We need a family toast before you take the stage." She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm, guiding me toward the heavy oak doors of the study. I followed, unaware that I was walking into the mouth of a trap designed to swallow me whole. The study felt claustrophobic, the air thick with the scent of old leather and tobacco. Delphine poured 4 glasses of vintage scotch, but as she reached for mine, she suddenly gasped, clutching her chest. Her glass shattered on the Persian rug. "My heart! Aurelia, help me!" she cried, collapsing toward the velvet chaise. I moved instantly, my medical training overriding every other instinct. I knelt beside her, checking her pulse, my back turned to my clutch bag on the desk. "Harlan, get the physician!" I shouted, focusing entirely on her shallow breaths. In that frantic blur, I didn't see her hand move with surgical precision, sliding a preloaded syringe and 2 vials of amber liquid into the hidden pocket of my gown and the silk lining of my bag. The doors burst open. Not just Harlan, but the family physician and 2 of our most prominent neighbors. Delphine suddenly sat up, her weakness replaced by a look of horrified realization. "Oh, Aurelia, not now, not tonight!" she wailed, her voice reaching a pitch that ensured everyone in the hallway could hear. She reached into my gown pocket and pulled out the syringe, holding it up like a trophy of my shame. "I tried to hide your addiction, I tried to save you, but you're doing this in my own house? Your soul is already gone to the needle." The room went silent, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my lungs. Harlan didn't ask me for an explanation. He didn't look for the truth in my eyes. He simply laughed, a dry, hollow, cruel sound that echoed off the bookshelves. I should have known, he said, shaking his head with a look of mock disgust. The long nights at the hospital, the exhaustion, it wasn't medicine. It was this. He turned his back on me and reached for Vera, my older sister, who appeared in the doorway with a handkerchief pressed to her eyes. He took her hand, the very hand that had been waiting in the shadows for years. In that moment, the architecture of their betrayal became clear. The addict narrative wasn't a sudden accusation. It was a long-term liquidation of my life to secure Harlan's wealth for Vera. The injustice was a physical blow, a scream trapped in my throat. But I chose not to let it out. I stood up, smoothing the silk of my dress, my spine turning to iron. The loudest lie cannot silence the quietest truth in a heart that knows itself. I watched them, my mother the director, my sister the understudy, and my fiancé the fool, and I realized that the woman they were trying to bury didn't exist. I was Aurelia, a woman who had spent years learning how to stitch life back together, and I would not be the one to bleed out on this floor. Delphine wasn't finished. She pulled a folded document from the desk, a forged psychiatric evaluation, and a report she'd already sent to the state medical board. My phone vibrated in my hand, a digital notification, license status, suspended pending investigation. My life's work, the thousands of hours of sacrifice, the very essence of my identity, was erased in the span of a heartbeat. "We've already spoken to the board," Delphine said, her voice now cold and professional. "For your own good, you're unfit to practice." Vera stepped closer to Harlan, her eyes gleaming with a predatory triumph as she slid my engagement ring onto her own finger. It fit her perfectly. "Don't worry, little sister," she whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint and malice. "We'll pay for your rehab. We'll do it out of the kindness of our hearts. Family takes care of its own, even the broken ones." She squeezed Harlan's arm, a silent declaration of her victory. I looked at the ring, then at Harlan's cowardice, and finally at my mother's face. She looked proud. She looked like a woman who had successfully pruned a garden of a troublesome weed. I understood the legal reality immediately. In this city, with their money and the board in their pockets, I could not win a frontal assault. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to leave the table and build your own. I didn't plead. I didn't beg for my career. "You think you've taken everything," I said, my voice steady, carrying a chilling clarity that made Delphine's smile falter for the first time. "You took the paper, the ring, and the house. But you didn't just kill my career, Mother. You killed the daughter who would have died for you. I hope the price you got for my life was worth it, because from this moment on, you are all dead to me." I turned and walked out of the study, through the ballroom of whispering ghosts, and into the night. The morning mist clung to the window panes of my childhood bedroom like a shroud, blurring the moss-draped oaks of Charleston into ghostly shapes. I lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock echoing through the hollow hallways downstairs. The silence of the house felt heavier than the torrential rain that had battered the roof hours ago. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, intending to check the time, but a notification from my security app froze my heart. The access codes for the front gate and the main entrance had been changed at 3 a.m. I hadn't just been asked to leave. I had been locked out of my own history. It's a strange thing to realize that the place where you took your first steps has suddenly become a fortress designed to keep you out. Have you ever woken up in your own bed and felt like a trespasser? I dressed in silence, choosing a simple wool coat over the designer silk I had worn to the gala. As I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards groaned under my weight, sounding like a warning. Vera was already there, leaning against the banister and sipping coffee from a porcelain cup that had belonged to our grandmother. She was already dressed in my mother's vintage pearls, the iridescent beads glowing against her throat like trophies. "Oh, Aurelia," she purred, her eyes scanning my suitcase with a cruel sort of hunger. "I thought I heard the help moving around. You should hurry. The cleaners are coming at 10 to clear out the rest of the trash." I felt the heat rise in my chest, a sharp retort dancing on my tongue, but I chose to swallow it. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a scene. I looked through her as if she were made of glass and walked toward the stairs. Some battles are won by choosing which fires to put out, and which to let burn. Before I reached the front door, I caught sight of Elias in the rose garden through the foyer windows. He was 80 years old, his back hunched from 40 years of tending to the magnolia grounds. He was the only person who had ever told me my father would have been proud of my medical degree. I stepped out onto the damp grass, the cold air biting at my skin. "Elias," I said softly, reaching into my pocket. I slipped him my last $50 bill, the only physical cash I had left after Delphine froze my accounts. "Thank you for everything. Please, keep the roses blooming for the memory of my father. Don't let the weeds take over the beauty he loved." He gripped my hand, his eyes clouded with a sadness that mirrored my own. "Go on now, Miss Aurelia," he whispered. "You've got a heart too big for this house anyway." "Aurelia, in the solar room, now!" My mother's voice shattered the moment, sharp and cold as a winter gale. I turned to see Delphine standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the morning light. I followed her into the solar room, where the air smelled of stale lilies and expensive ink. A private notary sat at the glass table, flanked by a man in a charcoal suit, a lawyer I recognized as the primary counsel for Harlan's family. The table was covered in a sea of white paper, each sheet a nail in the coffin of my inheritance. Delphine didn't offer me a seat. She simply tapped a finger on a document titled Renunciation of All Claims and Voluntary Power of Attorney. "Because of your condition," she began, her voice dripping with a fake, practiced empathy, "we have to protect the family assets. If you sign these, we can handle your affairs privately. If you don't, we will be forced to file for a public conservatorship based on your medical incapacity. Think of the scandal, Aurelia. Think of what's left of your reputation." I stared at the legal jargon, my mind racing through the undue influence and duress clauses I had studied in my forensic medicine rotations. She was misrepresenting the law, banking on my desperation to make me sign away my life. I picked up the fountain pen, its weight cold in my hand. As the lawyer adjusted his glasses, he muttered something to Delphine about merging the Magnolia shares into the Lucas Harlan Trust per the primary beneficiary's request. My heart skipped. My father's actual will, the one I had seen a glimpse of years ago, left the majority of the estate's shares to me upon completion of my medical degree. Delphine wasn't just protecting the family, she was actively stealing my future to pay off the gambling debts Lucas had accrued and the failing real estate gambles Harlan had made. They needed my signature to turn my father's legacy into their personal ATM. A quote my father used to say echoed in my mind. "Wealth is what you give, not what you keep." I realized then that if I fought them now, in this room, with their bought notary and their puppet lawyer, I would lose my mind before I ever won the case. I needed time. I needed a different kind of leverage. I signed the papers with a hand so steady it surprised even me. "I hope you enjoy the house, Mother," I said, my voice barely a whisper but echoing in the quiet room. A house built on a lie has no foundation. I would rather sleep on the street than under a roof held up by my father's stolen blood. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic one last time, bypassing the trunks of expensive gowns and jewelry. In the far corner, tucked beneath a tattered tarp, was the steel box. It was a heavy, military-grade locker my father had used during his service, secured with a reinforced padlock. It contained my research, my journals, and the few honest mementos I had of a man who actually loved me. I dragged it toward the stairs, the metal screeching against the floorboards. It was the only thing of value I was taking. Everything else, the silk, the gold, the prestige, I left behind for the vultures to fight over. As I reached the end of the long gravel driveway, my suitcase in one hand and the heavy steel box in the other, a familiar engine roared behind me. Harlan's silver sports car skidded to a halt, Vera sitting in the passenger seat with a smug, pitying expression. Harlan rolled down the window, his designer sunglasses obscuring his eyes. "Need a ride to the bus station, Aurelia? Or maybe the local shelter? I'd hate for people to see a member of this family hitchhiking." I didn't look at him. I didn't even break my stride. I walked past the car as if it were a heap of scrap metal, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is absolutely nothing at all. I reached the bus stop at the edge of the estate just as the sun began to burn through the fog. I sat on the cold bench and looked down at the rusted latch of the steel box. It was all I had left of a life that had been full just 24 hours ago. My hands were stained with dust and ink, and my pockets were empty. But as the bus pulled up, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The hardest walk you can take is the one that leads you away from people who don't see your worth, but it's the only walk that leads home. The scent of dust, diesel, and sun-scorched metal replaced the humid jasmine of Charleston. 8 years had passed since I stepped onto that bus with nothing but a steel box and a shattered name. I didn't vanish into a gutter, as Delphine had hoped. Instead, I found a world where blood is just a biological reality, and your worth is measured by the steady rhythm of your hands under fire. Now, as Major Aurelia, a lead trauma surgeon in the United States Army, I've learned that a seed must be buried in the dark before it can reach for the light. Have you ever had to bury your old self just to survive? I did, and the woman who grew from those ashes is someone my mother would no longer recognize. The forward operating base was a chaotic symphony of urgency. I stood in the center of the surgical tent, the flickering flashlight reflecting off my scalpel as the roar of a distant convoy echoed through the valley. Charleston society feels like a fever dream now, a collection of ghosts I left behind to build a life where character is measured by the lives you save, not the lies your family tells. I looked at the steel box tucked under my cot. It no longer held just memories of my father. It held my field journals and the medals I earned in silence. Each one was a silent scream of victory against a mother who tried to erase my existence. A mass casualty event hit at 0200 hours. The ground vibrated with the rhythmic thud of mortar fire, but my hands remained steady. I operated for 20 straight hours, the copper scent of blood thick in the air. I wasn't the fragile girl they broke in that solar room anymore. I was a surgeon forged in the crucible of the forgotten. During a brief lull, I moved to the triage area and found a wounded local child, no older than 6. I knelt in the dirt, ignoring the rank on my shoulders, and began to clean her wounds with the same precision I would use on a general. I whispered, "You are safe now," in her native tongue. Sometimes a kind word is the only medicine that truly heals a heart. The atmosphere shifted when a special operations team sprinted toward the tent, their faces masked by dirt and exhaustion. They were carrying a man whose rank was obscured by blood-soaked fatigues, but his presence commanded a silence that even the mortars couldn't break. This was Killian. He had been hit during a high-stakes rescue mission, and the medics were already shaking their heads. They saw a lost cause. I saw a soul that wasn't ready to leave. While my family in South Carolina likely told stories of my addiction over brunch, I was the only person on this continent capable of performing the surgery required to keep this man's heart beating. My medical license was never truly lost. It was simply forged anew in the fires of service. As I worked on Cillian, his tactical vest was cut away, revealing a classified map tucked against his chest. Data that meant everything to the mission. My assistant hesitated, reaching for the intel, but I blocked his hand. The oath of a healer knows no borders and fears no generals, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I prioritized the man over the map, working with a cold, brilliant efficiency that left the room in awe. I wasn't an addict. I was an addict of excellence, a guardian of life in a place where death was the only constant. Days later, the desert heat softened as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. I sat in the low-lit recovery room, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound in the quiet. Killian opened his eyes, the fog of anesthesia clearing as he focused on me. He didn't see a disgraced socialite. He saw the Major who had pulled him back from the edge. "You didn't just fix my heart, Major," he whispered, his voice raspy but firm. "You reminded me why it's worth fighting for. There's a stoic fire in you that most people spend their whole lives trying to find." I felt a rare crack in my armor. For the first time in years, I spoke of Charleston, of the mahogany tables and the velvet traps. Killian listened, his expression hardening with a protective fury I hadn't seen in a man before. He reached out, his hand rough but gentle. "True honor isn't found in a ballroom, Aurelia," he said, using my name as if it were a title of nobility. "It's built in the trenches, and you are the most honorable person I've ever met. The greatest revenge is a life lived so well that the shadows of your past can no longer find you." In that moment, I realized I was no longer alone in my war. We bonded over that shared philosophy, a quiet pact made in the wreckage of a conflict zone. I looked at my reflection in a polished surgical tray on the bedside table. I saw the colonel's eagle on my collar, and Cillian, a general with more power in his little finger than Harlan's entire family, standing by my side. The war for my soul was finally over. I had found my anchor in the ashes of my old life. I looked at the medals in my box, and then at the horizon. I was ready to go back, not to settle a score, but to reclaim the name they thought they had buried. The handwritten letter felt like a relic from a previous life, the heavy cream cardstock a stark contrast to the utilitarian reports I had handled for years. Delphine's elegant, cursive script flowed across the page, each word dripping with a vulnerability that felt entirely too calculated. She claimed to be terminally ill, begging for one last meeting to make amends for the scars she had left on my soul. I sat in my quarters at the base, my breath steady as I traced the embossed family crest. I could see through the theatrics, the desperate reach of a woman whose power was fading. Yet, I decided to return. Not because I trusted her, but because I finally trusted myself to no longer be her victim. Before I boarded the transport, Cillian caught my hand, his eyes scanning my face with a quiet, protective intensity. "Aurelia, you know the nature of predators better than anyone," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "They don't change their stripes just because they're losing their teeth." I looked at him, feeling the solid weight of his presence, the man who had become my anchor. "I know," I replied softly. "But closure isn't something they give you. It's something you take. I'm going back to Charleston to reclaim the final pieces of myself they think they still own." That conversation stayed with me, a shield against the ghosts of Magnolia Estate. Upon arriving in Charleston, I didn't go straight to the house. Instead, I directed my driver to the local veterans hospital, a sprawling, underfunded facility on the outskirts of town. I walked through the surgical wing. The familiar scent of antiseptic grounded me. Without a word to the administrators, I made a significant, anonymous donation to their trauma department, specifically for surgical equipment. It was a silent testament to the fact that my success was fueled by service, not the greed that poisoned my bloodline. I walked out of that hospital feeling a quiet, terrifying confidence. I was no longer the broken exile Charleston remembered. I was a commander of my own destiny. The restaurant was one of those dimly lit, upscale establishments where the silverware clinks like a threat, and the air smells of expensive perfume and ancient secrets. Delphine was already seated, draped in silk that looked far too healthy for a terminally ill woman. Vera and Harlan sat beside her, their faces carefully arranged into masks of humbled misfortune. As I approached, I saw Harlan's eyes linger on me, a flicker of shock crossing his face. I had aged like fine wine, forged by the sun and the steel of the battlefield, while Vera had become a brittle socialite, her skin tightened by vanity and bitterness. Have you ever noticed how the people who try to break you often end up breaking themselves? Delphine began her masterclass in gaslighting. She wept into a lace handkerchief, speaking of regrets that keep her awake at night, and the burden of family duty. Vera reached out to touch my hand, a gesture as hollow as her soul, while Harlan looked at the table, unable to meet my gaze. "Aurelia, dear," Delphine sobbed. "We've made so many mistakes, but the Magnolia name is all we have left, and right now, it's under siege." I watched them with a detachment that felt like a superpower. Every tear felt scripted, every sigh a rehearsed beat in a play I had seen 1,000 times before. Then came the true motive. Delphine revealed that the family business was drowning in $15 million of debt, the result of Harlan's failed real estate gambles and Lucas's unchecked waste. They needed me to sign as a co-guarantor on a high-interest bridge loan. They spoke of preserving the legacy and saving the family home, assuming I was still the same clueless girl who would trade her future for a mother's hug. The legal document they pushed across the table was a limited liability partnership agreement. My medical mind quickly parsed the fine print. It secretly made the cosigner liable for 100% of the debt if the primary failed. They weren't looking for a daughter. They were looking for a human shield. Looking at that contract, I realized that some hearts never heal. They only rot. My mother wasn't dying. She was starving for a way out of her own mess. I remembered a philosophy I had lived by during the hardest nights in the trenches. Family is a circle of love, not a cage of debt. I looked at the three of them, the ghosts of my past, and I felt a wave of disgust so profound it was almost peaceful. They truly believed they could still play me like a mark. They hadn't realized that the woman they were talking to had operated on dying men while the world exploded around her. Their petty scams were nothing compared to the war I had already won. "You didn't call me home to heal a relationship," I said, my voice cutting through Delphine's sobbing like a scalpel through thin skin. "You called me to be a human shield for your bankruptcy." The table went silent. Vera's hand retreated, and Delphine's tears stopped as if a faucet had been turned off. I didn't sign the paper. Instead, I leaned back, observing the cracks in their composure. I told them I would consider it, a calculated move to keep them hovering in a state of false security. I needed them desperate and distracted as I prepared for the wedding they didn't even know was coming. Harlan tried to pull me aside as we left, his hand reaching for my elbow. I stepped back before he could touch me. "Aurelia, look, I'm so sorry about 8 years ago," he whispered, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the girl who used to adore him. "I was young. I was pressured." I cut him off before he could finish. "Apologies without change are just manipulations, Harlan. You chose a shadow back then because it was easier than standing in the light with me. Don't be surprised that you're now living in the dark." I left him standing there, a man who had traded a diamond for a piece of glass, and walked out into the Charleston night. I stood on the pier, the sound of the Atlantic waves crashing against the wood, the city lights reflecting in the water like a promise. I had walked away from that table, leaving them with the bill and their own mounting desperation. I whispered a quiet promise to myself. Forgiveness is for the soul, but boundaries are for the survival of the spirit. I hadn't just dodged a bullet. I had seen the hand that fired it. I left them staring at a blank signature line, not knowing that by trying to bury me in their debt, they had just handed me the shovel to dig their own graves. The historic Charleston Theater was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, its velvet curtains and gold leaf ceilings whispering of a grandeur I once believed I belonged to. Tonight, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm. I stood in the dressing room, the white silk of my gown feeling less like a costume and more like armor. Beside me, Killian checked his watch, his presence a calm, immovable force. Our union wasn't born of society's expectations or a strategic merger of bank accounts. It was a bond forged in the mud of the trenches and the sterile light of surgical tents, built on a foundation of respect that Harlan could never comprehend. Have you ever realized that the most powerful love is the one that doesn't need to be proven to the world, only to the person standing beside you? As I prepared to walk toward the altar, a small, shy bridesmaid stood near the heavy oak doors, her eyes wide with the solemnity of the ceremony. I knelt beside her, ignoring the rustling of her dress. "True beauty isn't in the silk of your dress, my dear," I whispered, adjusting the wreath on her head. "It's in the courage to be kind in a noisy world." "You're doing so well." She offered a shy, genuine smile, a rare moment of human warmth on a night staged like a play. That small connection was the only thing that kept me going as the doors finally opened. The orchestral music swelled, but as I stepped into the hall, the melody felt fractured. Standing in the back pews were Delphine, Vera, and Harlan. They hadn't been invited, yet they stood there like uninvited specters. They were dressed in mourning black, a deliberate, theatrical display of disapproval. As I passed, I caught the rhythmic hiss of their whispers. They weren't just attending. They were sowing seeds of doubt among the city's elite, murmuring about my shameful past and medical disgrace. I didn't let my pace falter. I fixed my gaze on Tillian, his eyes a steady anchor in a sea of toxic performativity. Then, the lights shifted, and the room seemed to contract. Vera didn't remain in her seat. She stepped into the aisle, but she wasn't wearing black anymore. She had shed her coat to reveal a custom, shimmering white gown, a blatant, desperate violation of bridal etiquette. It was a psychological strike, an attempt to steal the spotlight and mock my unworthiness. Beside her, Harlan leaned into a group of investors, his voice loud enough to carry through the hushed hall. "I feel for the general," he sneered, his eyes darting to the cameras. "He's marrying a broken addict who is only after his pension. Charleston knows the truth, even if he doesn't." Delphine moved toward the stage, her face a mask of manufactured grief. She didn't wait for the officiant to speak. "Aurelia," she cried out, her voice echoing off the gold leaf ceiling. "Before you take these sacred vows, you must confess. For your own soul's sake, tell these people the truth about your addiction. Don't let this man marry a lie." The cameras, the ones she had undoubtedly tipped off, focused on me, waiting for the crack in my composure. It was a high-stakes ambush, a calculated move to force a mental breakdown in front of the very world I had fought to rejoin. I stood center stage, the silence of the theater becoming a suffocating weight. But as I looked at my mother, I remembered a philosophy I had lived by during the hardest nights of the war. A diamond is just a piece of charcoal that handled stress exceptionally well. I wasn't panicking, I was observing. I saw the desperation in Vera's white dress and the hollowness in Harlan's sneer. They weren't powerful. They were terrified. They were the hyenas trying to distract a lioness with noise because they knew they couldn't win a fight of substance. "I want to thank you all for coming," I said, my voice carrying a chilling, stoic politeness that silenced the murmurs. "A guest is only as welcome as the peace they bring to a home. I see you've brought none tonight, Mother. Yet I still choose to see your pain as a request for love, even if you've forgotten how to ask for it properly." The room held its breath. Delphine's eyes narrowed, taking my composure as a sign of weakness. She signaled to a man in the back, a local official she had likely bribed, to bring forward what she called final evidence. She was walking into a tactical dead end, and she didn't even know it. Harlan stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab my arm as if to save me from the impending disgrace. "Aurelia, stop this charade before it's too late," he hissed. Before his fingers could touch my skin, Killian stepped between us. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Killian didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was a command to stand down. "You're interfering with a private ceremony," Killian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I suggest you return to your seat before the consequences become permanent." I looked at Vera, standing there in her stolen color, and I offered her a genuine, pitying smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen the sun and no longer feared the dark. "You can wear the color of a bride, Vera," I whispered, the words intended only for her. "But you will never know the weight of the honor that comes with it. You're wearing a costume, I'm wearing a life." I turned back to the altar, my spine turning to steel. The first strains of the wedding march began again, but this time, the air didn't vibrate with music. It vibrated with the approaching tread of something far more formidable. The air in the theater grew thin, a suffocating vacuum that felt like the moment before a lightning strike. Just as the priest began the final blessing, the heavy mahogany doors were kicked open with a violence that made the crystal chandeliers shriek. Local Charleston police officers surged into the hall, their heavy boots thudding against the marble in a jagged, aggressive rhythm. Delphine stood up in the front row, her mourning veil pushed back to reveal eyes burning with a terrifying, predatory triumph. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "Search her!" she screamed. "Search her bridal clutch! My daughter is carrying the very poison that ruined her life. She's high at her own altar." I didn't flinch. I watched the lead officer approach, his radio crackling with a static that sounded like a death rattle for my reputation. He snatched my silk bag from the altar rail and tore open the lining. A small, clear plastic bag filled with white powder fell onto the floor, landing with a soft, final thud. The guests gasped, a wave of horrified whispers washing over the pews. Harlan stepped forward, his face twisted into a sneer of pure satisfaction. "Once an addict, always a liability," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You can't hide the rot behind a lace veil, Aurelia. You're a disgrace to this city and a danger to that man." Looking back now, I should have felt terror. but all I felt was a profound, quiet pity for the woman who birthed me. I knew the legal reality of what she had done. This was a staged ambush, a direct violation of Fourth Amendment protections, orchestrated through bribes and old money influence. Delphine wanted an immediate, public arrest to destroy Cillian's career by association. As the officers reached for their handcuffs, I looked Delphine directly in the eye. To destroy your own child just to prove a long-dead lie is a debt your soul will never be able to repay, I said, my voice calm and steady. I hope you enjoy the audience you've gathered, Mother, because it's the last one you'll ever have. Then the world began to shake. A deep vibrating bass rumble started in the floorboards, growing until the very foundations of the theater groaned. The sound of heavy helicopter rotors thumping overhead became deafening, rattling the stained glass windows in their frames. Suddenly, the power cut out. The elegant amber glow of the theater was replaced by the blinding, blue-white searchlights of military choppers hovering just feet above the roof. The wedding music was gone, replaced by a synchronized rhythmic thud that made the police officers freeze. It was the sound of elite special forces boots hitting the pavement in perfect unison. The side exits burst open. 2 rows of soldiers in full tactical gear, their berets marking them as the best the nation had to offer, marched into the hall with a terrifying precision. They moved with a lethal grace that made the local police look like children playing with toy guns. The socialites in the pews cowered, their expensive silks rustling as they tried to shrink into the shadows. But the soldiers didn't aim their rifles at the crowd. They didn't aim at me. They formed an impenetrable corridor of steel and honor, standing between the altar and the police. They stood like statues, their rifles held at low ready, creating a wall that no bribe or lie could penetrate. I noticed a young soldier near the end of the line, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the trembling police chief. He looked like he was ready to level the building if a single hair on my head was touched. I reached out, my hand steady as I touched the sleeve of his camouflage jacket. "Stand easy, son," I whispered, the sound carrying in the sudden silence of the room. "The truth is the only weapon we need tonight. Don't let their fear become yours." Cillian stepped forward then, shedding his tuxedo jacket to reveal the olive-drab undershirt and the high-ranking military insignias he usually kept hidden from the Charleston elite. He looked at the lead officer, who was now sweating profusely, his handcuffs dangling uselessly from his hand. "You are currently interfering with a protected asset of the United States Department of Defense," Cillian said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that commanded total obedience. "Step back immediately, or you will be detained under the Patriot Act for treason against a serving officer. This is no longer your jurisdiction." Delphine and Vera shrank back into their seats, their faces turning a ghostly, translucent white. They stared at the rows of soldiers, their minds unable to process the reality shifting beneath their feet. They had come to a wedding to watch a con artist fall. They realized now that the soldiers weren't here to celebrate a marriage. They were here to protect a commander. Justice may travel a long and winding road, but it always arrives exactly when the light is needed most. My years of silent service in the trenches had finally built a fortress around me that their whispers could never breach. I looked down at the planted drugs on the floor, the pathetic remnants of my mother's last desperate gamble. Then I looked at the rows of men who had traveled across the world to stand by me. I turned to the hall, my voice clear and resonant, echoing off the high ceilings like a bell. "My mother spent 8 years telling you I was an addict," I said, the words cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "She was right. I am addicted to the truth. And tonight, the truth has finally come home to Charleston." I looked at the commanding officer's trembling hands, then at Cillian, knowing that those rows of soldiers were just the beginning of the storm that was about to sweep through this city. I felt a surge of power I hadn't known since childhood. The stage of their lives was empty. I wasn't merely surviving. I was in command. The silence that followed Cillian's declaration was absolute, a heavy velvet curtain dropping over the shocked socialites of Charleston. I stood at the altar, the white silk of my gown glowing under the harsh military searchlights that continued to sweep through the theater windows. Through the rows of special forces, a high-ranking general stepped forward. He ignored the trembling police officers and the ashen-faced guests, his focus solely on me. He stopped exactly 3 paces away, his spine a pillar of iron, and snapped a crisp, formal salute. The synchronized clack of his heels on the marble floor echoed like a gavel. "Colonel Aurelia," the general declared, his voice resounding and undeniable. "By order of the Pentagon, your military records have been declassified. The hospitalizations for addiction that this family cited were in fact classified medical missions and recovery from combat surgery at government security facilities." The hall fell silent. Then he turned to the crowd, producing a sealed document. "The medical evidence provided by Delphine is actually a stolen classified military record, altered to facilitate a civilian fraud. This is now a federal matter. The truth is like the sun. You can obscure it for a while, but it never disappears. My scars are not marks of shame. They are my medals." Cillian didn't waste a second. He moved toward the Charleston police chief, handing over a thick leather folder. "This contains a federal warrant for Delphine and her associates," Cillian said, his tone devoid of heat but filled with an icy terminal authority. "We have the original codicil to her late husband's will and evidence of systematic probate fraud. The Magnolia estate was purchased using funds stolen from Aurelia 8 years ago. Because of this, a constructive trust was being legally enforced. Under South Carolina and federal law, the transfer was void. I was now the sole, rightful owner of the estate." The realization hit Delphine like a physical blow. Her social world, built on a foundation of whispers and theft, disintegrated in an instant. Vera and Harlan stood paralyzed as the local police, now acting under federal oversight, stepped forward with handcuffs. Fraudulent transfer of assets and the forgery of military-grade records in the United States carry mandatory prison time. As the officers led Delphine toward the exit, her head was bowed, the iridescent pearls on her neck finally looking like the cold stones they were. As she was led past me, I stepped into her path. I didn't scream, and I didn't gloat. I simply reached into my small bag and pulled out a tarnished silver locket, the one my father had worn every day of his life. I gently took her cuffed hand and pressed it into her palm. "I don't hate you, Mother," I whispered, my voice thick with a somber, final piece. "I just finally love myself enough to stop you from hurting me. I hope you find the truth where you're going, because you've lost it here." She looked at me for a split second, a flash of genuine fear in her eyes, before she was ushered out into the night. The prestigious guests began to filter out in a hush of collective shame, their eyes avoiding mine. Harlan tried to approach me, his hand outstretched as if he still had the right to speak. "Aurelia, please. I didn't know. I didn't even stop to hear the rest of his lie." I walked past him as if he were a shadow, stepping into the warm, protective embrace of Cillian. The best revenge isn't to take an eye for an eye. It is to live a life so meaningful and high that those who tried to bury you can no longer even touch your hem. I looked at Cillian, the man who had seen my soul in the trenches long before the world saw my rank. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "The world finally sees the woman I've always known," he whispered. I smiled, a genuine, tired, but triumphant smile. "I didn't win because of the soldiers, Cillian. I won the day I decided my worth wasn't up for debate." We stood there in the center of the theater, the center of the world, and I knew that the ghost of success had finally been laid to rest. As the first light of dawn began to bleed through the Atlantic horizon, I stood on the balcony of the theater. I reached up and unfastened my bridal veil, feeling the delicate lace catch the morning breeze. I let go, watching it fly into the Charleston wind, a white flag of surrender to the past. I was no longer a daughter defined by a mother's hate, a sister fueled by doki, or an ex-fiancé marked by betrayal. I was simply Aurelia,